Hello, everybody. Colonel Roxanne Towner Watkins and War Hamster Brady here on our number two, part two of our Secret Society series. Brady, how are you?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to the show today.
All right, kick it off.
Well, let's see. Last episode, we really talked about, what secret societies are all about and what their goals are. And pretty much, there's a thesis. Thesis one is, these people may, my focus today is going to be on Skull and Bones. There's a bunch of other secret societies. You'll be talking about the Ritchie Boys a little bit. But, one theory is that these are people that just share a common background, or whether it be some kind of fraternal, organization. It could be some kind of Masonic lodge. And, basically these are just people that network. And of course they know each other, so they offer each other jobs. And, that's just basic networking. That's the innocent version. The other version of it is that this is a nefarious groups, or some of them are nefarious, and they plot together. They got their more than secret handshakes. They may have rituals, satanic, what have you, or sexual. Who knows? We're not even going to go into those details, but the theory is that it's a much more nefarious network that they use basically to manipulate events, around the country and more specifically the globe. And so we're going to go through a bunch of those connections, and we'll let the listeners decide which theory is correct. Are they the innocent networking type of organizations, or are they the puppet masters that spin their little webs of deceit around the globe?
Okay, so you want to launch into the background of Skull and Bones?
Yeah, absolutely. So Skull and Bones is a secret society formed at Yale University in 1832. The first class was 1833. Skull and Bones, every year, they choose 15 members of the junior class who will serve as the active members for the next year. There's, over the generations, there's active alumni connection with the people that are active at the group. But at any given time, there are only 15 active members. Whether they're active in their post-collegiate lives is a story we're going to get into a little bit. The first group of Skull and Bones was founded, and there's some very interesting founding members. These are some of the blue blood aristocratic original American families. These are deeply Puritan Protestants. You're going to find almost no Roman Catholics in Skull and Bones. You're going to find they didn't get their first Jewish member till 1936, 103 years later. They didn't get their first black member till, I believe, 1964. So these are Anglo-American elitists, absolutely Anglophiles, I think is the word we use. The two gentlemen that are named as the founders are William Huntington Russell and a guy by the name of Frederick Ellsworth Mather, or Mather. I believe it's pronounced Mather. And they've got some interesting backgrounds. And there's another couple of the original founders I'm going to go through real quick. But it really points out that how well connected these people are. And again, this is America's upper class. They only marry among their own class of people. You have to come from the right family to even be in their social circle. And that's really what this is all about, what these people are. So we'll start with William Huntington Russell, because he's kind of the godfather of Skull and Bones. They've got on campus, they've got what's called a temple, or I'm sorry, it's called a crypt, where they have their secret rituals. There's been all kinds of intrigue over what happens behind closed doors there. Not a whole lot of the information is verifiable. So I'm not going to dive into it too deeply, but I believe some of it's probably very legitimate. And there's some eyewitness stories from Yale University of some things that have been seen, maybe a couple of stealth missions to try to break in. Like I said, none of that's 100% verified. But let's talk about Russell and his background, should we?
Yes.
All right. His name is William Huntington Russell. What's his background? He's descended from several old New England families. And I'm going to name about 5 or 6 of these families he's descended from. The first one is the Huntingtons, from which he got his middle name. There's 3 big branches of the Huntington family. Some famous people. There was Samuel Huntington, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. and was also a delegate to the Continental Congress. He's got an ancestor named Jebediah Huntington, who was a brigadier general under George Washington. Another one of the family members was Ebenezer Huntington, and he was one of Washington's officers when Cornwallis surrendered. He was there. We got a Jabaz Huntington, who was a U.S. senator from Connecticut. Now that's a theory that's going to keep. I mean, that's a story that's going to keep popping up over and over again. An awful lot of skull and bones people were politicians from Connecticut, and we're going to go through it later today. But there's a lot of that, so listen for that. There's another Samuel Huntington, who was the governor of Ohio from 1808 to 1810. And there's another fun one, was Elijah Mills Huntington. He was an Indiana House of Representatives congressman, and he was also a delegate to the DNC convention for the 1860 election. And that's interesting because that's when the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats split, ran separate candidates, which allowed Lincoln to win the 1860 election with only getting 41% of the popular vote. So that was a Huntington. And of course, it's a namesake for Huntington Beach, California. So the Huntingtons are very old American blood. And this guy, Russell, is related to them. In fact, he uses their middle name. Any comments there?
No, but that is a common practice I've noticed with their naming rituals. Like the Bush family, when I dove into that, was the first time, because I don't do any genealogy or anything like that. It was the first time that I recognized, like 7 generations back, when I got to their slave ship captain guy that was still living in the UK at the time, or Britain at the time, England, that every single one of them, based on the different families as they intermarried, repeat every generation the names of the original founders.
Yeah, we got so many examples of that. You got Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yes.
Well, who were the Delanos?
Yes.
Well, very old American opium smuggling family.
Yes.
That's another common theme. What's the other great one is Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Of course, his father was Senator. His grandfather was Senator Aldrich. I mean, and over and over and over again they use that. In fact, the next name I'm going to pull up that's related to Russell does the same thing. This is the Pierpont family, and the patriarch of that is a guy by the name of James Pierpont. He was considered the founder of Yale University. He was a Congregationalist minister, and I bring that up because an awful lot of Bonesmen were Puritan Protestant ministers, and that's a theme that's going to happen over and over again. You know, we talk about if you're going to manipulate every institution of American lives, you can't forget the religious side, and they were certainly there all over the place. So that's something you don't expect. You think these are all politicians, but no, they touched every aspect of society.
Well, what's interesting about that is that, the story that I tell that kind of reinforces what you just said is the takeover of Hawaii. It was orchestrated by the Protestant ministers that went out there and with the money that they had earned, bought sugar plantations. And those are the people and they all had ties to the Northeast money that were funding their missions. And, there's a lot of people that believe that they were doing that they were basically like prophet people disguised as ministers to do exactly what they did, to basically steal Hawaii. But nonetheless, it's what happened.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because one of the 6 famous families that Russell is related to is the Bingham family. And let me just tell you about the Binghams, basically what you just said. The patriarch there is a guy named Hiram, Hiram Bingham. He's the leader of the first Protestant missionaries to Hawaii. He's the guy who translated the Bible to the Hawaiian language. And if anybody's ever read James Michener's Hawaii, this is the guy he caricatured for that. It's Hiram Bingham. So exactly what you just said. Our histories, our research just intersected again.
And so we don't practice this, guys. This is not a scripted thing. But let me just put another card on top of the pile here, because since you mentioned Nelson Rockefeller, he comes from what? Protestant ministers, right? And so he funded and is kind of considered the patriarch of the Wycliffe College that gave birth to the SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, that went down and translated all of the Bibles in Latin America. And basically, they were not there for that reason at all. They were prospectors for oil and gold and everything else. And while the students from Wycliffe actually were the translators, the people that were down there as the, parental authority were actually spies. And they were ferreting out the indigenous Indian tribes that had kind of burrowed their way into the woods and couldn't be found. And they were vicious, but they let the missionaries in there. And then they would come back and tell Nelson Rockefeller's crew where they were at, and they'd go in and massacre them.
It's you almost can't make this stuff up. But what were they thinking? How do you preach morality and act immorally, and do it on such a grand scale, time after time?
It worked.
Well, finishing up with Bingham, he had a son, Hiram Bingham II, who was also a missionary to Hawaii. He had a third, the grandson, Hiram Bingham III, and he's interesting. He was a U.S. senator from Connecticut. He's also a governor of Connecticut. That's that theme. That's that story over and over again. But this guy's also the explorer who, quote unquote, discovered Machu Picchu. And they'd already, the natives already knew it was there, but he's the one who basically taught the Europeans where it was. There's another Hiram Bingham the fourth, and he was the U.S. vice consul in France during World War II. So this is a family that gets around, and that's one of Russell's antecedents. Interestingly enough, there was a naval ship called the USS Hiram Bingham in World War II. It was a World War II Liberty ship. So important family, obviously. Going back to the Pierponts, and the founder there is James Pierpont, the founder of Yale, congregational minister. He married a woman named Mary Hooker. The Hooker family is also one of these original noble families in the Northeast that Russell is related to. If Pierpont sounds familiar, that's because that's the namesake for James Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, who is the son of Junius Morgan and Juliet Pierpont. So it's like I said, they borrow the matriarchal side's name and use it as a middle name. So that's a lot of influence so far. The Hooker side of the family, once again, is the patriarch is Thomas Hooker. He's a congregational minister, and he's given credit for founding Connecticut. He descended with the Puritan leaders in Massachusetts and basically started a new colony. And he's one of those guys that fled England for religious persecution. He was going to get summoned to the High Court Commission. He's one of those guys who fled to Amsterdam before coming over. It's an interesting story. Fifth family, which is an important one, is the Willett family, Willett. And this is a family from Plymouth, Massachusetts. So they came over, I think, on the second boat. He was a co-captain of the colony's military with a guy by the name of Miles Standish. So we're talking real American history. He's also part of the peaceable surrender of New Amsterdam. We talked about how the Dutch traded New Amsterdam and now New York City to the English. Have I talked to you about that trade? So it was a trade. They were fighting over it. The Dutch didn't have a whole lot of ship or troops here in the New World, so they weren't really able to defend their territory. At the same time, the Dutch were doing a lot of trading in the East Indies, and the Dutch had a near monopoly on nutmeg, with the exception of one island owned by the Brits in the that's now in Indonesia that had the rest of the nutmegs. So they traded this small island to the English for what became New York or became Manhattan, and it was an even trade. And this guy Thomas Willett was there. Funny enough, neither England nor the Dutch own either property today, but and it worked out pretty well for the Americans. Uh, Willette was also the first and third mayor of New York City.
Wow.
Okay, so now we get into the Russell family itself. And that's the last bit he's descended of. Patriarch is a guy by the name of Noadiah Russell. He's a co-founder and one of the original trustees at Yale. The more important part of the Russell family is his cousin, Samuel Russell. And Samuel Russell was the founder of a shipping company called Russell and Company. And these guys were the largest U.S. trading house in China from 1824 to 1891. And I'm guessing you can bet what their number one cargo was. Yeah, it's opium. So really what we're talking about is Yale, the finest university, is founded by pirates for the most part, among other things.
Among other things.
And Russell would go on to fund, he would take the Skull and Bones and incorporate them into something called the Russell Trust. And we'll get into that a bit later, but that was about 20 years later. And the Russell Trust is a very, very wealthy nonprofit that funds all kinds of things. It's a very, very secretive organization.
Yeah, I've come across it a couple of times, but there's not a lot you can find out about it.
No, they keep it pretty secret. And that's one of the things about the secrecy is, we know the Skull and Bones lists used to be kept publicly in the Yale Library. Anthony Sutton found out all the members because I remember Iserbed, Charlotte Iserbed gave him her father's list of members, but they stopped publicizing the membership in the 1997. So we don't know any of the last 27 years. We don't know who the Bonesmen are.
And what happened in 1990s?
Well, I think what happened, some people were writing about it in the 80s, and we got some pretty bad publicity, unless you're thinking about a specific incident that I can't recall.
But I'm just suggesting that maybe the internet had something to do with that.
Oh, yeah, okay. That's yeah. Once their secrets came out, when your secrets come out and you're no longer a secret society, it can become problematic. But I think a lot of it had to do with the exposure of the Bushes.
True. Yeah.
And this isn't today. We're not going to do Bushes today because that's a full episode on its own. But it's a fun story, all those connections.
I agree.
Let's see. Let's do Alonzo Taft. He's one of the other co-founders. He's from the Taft family, Massachusetts origins. If you ever look at a phone book of Uxbridge, Massachusetts, about half people live there's last name is Taft. That's a small exaggeration, but they are the Uxbridge, Massachusetts founding family. The Taft family is notorious in American history. They've had people served in governments of Massachusetts, Ohio, Rhode Island, Utah, Vermont. And in the U.S. government, from the Taft family alone, we've had one Secretary of the Agriculture, 3 U.S. senators, 1 Attorney General, 1 Secretary of War, a Secretary of Defense, a President of the United States, and a Supreme Court Justice. That's from one family.
That's crazy.
It is. And here's some other fun things about the Tafts. One of the Tafts is a guy named Josiah Taft. His widow, after he passed away, became America's first woman voter in 1756.
That's crazy.
All right, and here's another theme you're going to see repeated. Ezra T. Benson, who's a member of the Tafts, was a key early apostle of the Mormon religion. We are going to find multiple Skull and Bones' connections to the LDS, Church of Latter-day Saints. And this is the first one, was Ezra T. Benson. Alfonso Taft was the U.S. Attorney General under Ruther B. Hayes. He was the Secretary of War under Ulysses Grant. This guy was the ambassador to both the Austria-Hungarian Empire until 1884, and then the ambassador to Russia in 1884-85. Now, that's a pretty important position considering what was going on in the European continent in the 1800s with all their wars.
Right.
Another thing about Alfonso Taft, he was a big supporter of black suffrage. And of course, he was the father of William Howard Taft and a couple of other Tafts that were Bonesmen, which we'll get into later. But William Howard Taft is a Skull and Bones member, his son, the only man in history to serve as president of the United States and on the Supreme Court. And I think we talked last week about a few other things Taft had done, like set up the world's first international court. So that's a Taft family. It's one of the co-founders of Skull and Bones. And so I ask you, do these seem like the kind of people that could be the puppet masters of everything that goes on behind the scenes of our government?
I think it's definitely a fair question to ask.
Okay, well, that's what we're trying to answer, and I'm not saying how it is. We're just presenting the evidence.
Well, and what I find interesting is a point that you made at the beginning of this is their intricate roles and in all of the different elements. They didn't just do politics. So, they're founding members, or at least part of the original cast of characters that created an entire religion called the Mormons.
Yeah, they were certainly influential in that.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's every aspect of society. All of our institutions have been infiltrated. Most of the time, when you look at the origins of some of these institutions, you're going to see a member of Skull and Bones as the founding member. They get there first, they set it, and then they put their people in place. And that's how they have institutional control. You talk about public-private. These people cross back and forth like you wouldn't believe, and that's really been their strategy. They don't have to be sitting at the top of an organization all the time, as long as they can set the trend.
They set the tone.
Exactly. There's another really interesting member of the original class of 1833. Guy with the name of Frederick Ellsworth Mather. That middle name's important, once again. So Frederick was New York State Assembly in 1857. That was his peak fame was New York State Assembly, but his background's interesting. He's the descendant of a guy by the name of Reverend Richard Mather, who came to Boston from England, and he was a New England Puritan minister. He's the grandfather to Cotton Mather. Does that name sound familiar? Salem witch trials.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the Puritan minister who led the Salem witch trials. He also led a successful revolt of 1689 against the British governor, but that didn't last too long. So he's also related to a guy by the name of Increase Mather, just like the word increase, who's a Puritan clergyman, and he ended up being the president of Harvard College from 1681 to 1701. So interesting connection there. Now, Frederick Ellsworth Mather his middle name is Ellsworth, and the Ellsworth family is worth mentioning. You've got a guy named Oliver Ellsworth, who's, I guess, would be his granduncle. He was a founding father and a framer of the Constitution, and he's one of the guys who played a big role in what's called the Connecticut Compromise. Do you remember when they came to Philadelphia, under the Articles of Confederation, we had a single House of Congress, and that was basically one representative per state. Madison shows up with a Virginia plan and wanted to keep it that way. Or I'm sorry, he wanted to be population-based, like the House of Representatives was supposed to be. So the bigger the state, more populous, the more representatives you have in Congress. Well, that's not fair to the small states. So the small states said, we're not going to sign this, but how about we do, they wanted to be one representative per state, which isn't fair to the big states. So to protect the big from the small and the small from the big, we had the Connecticut Compromise and got our bicameral legislature where the Senate is equal representation of the states and the House is population-based. And that's what this guy, Oliver Ellsworth, is the guy who helped propose that. So it's kind of a big deal in American history, I thought.
Very big deal.
Oliver Ellsworth would then become a U.S. Senator from Connecticut and third Chief Justice of the United States. And he's a little bit on our you-know-what list because he resigned, and the guy who replaced him is John Marshall, who did more to stomp on the Constitution than any Supreme Court justice in history during his 35-year reign of terror on original intent.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, there's a few other interesting people in the founding class, but they're not really going to make our point any better than we already have.
You definitely made your point.
Yeah. So yeah, with the point being, of course, that these are the blue bloods. The Skull and Bones is founded by America's nobility, our noble class. The families, the blue bloods, as my guy I love watching, Brian McClanahan, calls them, the Yankees.
The Yankees.
And by the way, these are the same families that they were the ones who put Abraham Lincoln into power and created the Republican Party. And they wanted the Civil War, these guys did. And we'll get into some of that later. There's a lot of evidence in Skull and Bones history of their participation in all of those events.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I thought you were going to talk a little bit about the Ritchie Boys before I jump into the next part.
Yeah, and the Ritchie Boys obviously is not a secret society, but what we thought is going to be a very interesting way because a lot of people have covered secret societies. What we want to do is present you with a multi-dimensional, I called it 3D, but Warhamster had some additional characterizations of it. But if you looked at the underlying that he just explained, that permeate every aspect of our lives, and they've collectively been educated and bred to be that, basically our royalty in a country that's not supposed to have royalty. But in addition to that, you have some other like a second dimension and a third dimension that you have to understand visually float above those, that allows them all to tie into some even more critical elements, which is like the intelligence. So none of what he just described happens in a vacuum. It all happens with let me use the word worker bee level of intelligence gathering in order for them to stay where they are. You would never have been able to accomplish this kind of blue blood gentry or royalty without having the second and third dimension floating around it. And one of the fascinating things that I came across, and the guy that wrote the book actually follows me, and I bought his book. It's called The Quiet Contingent, and his name is J.B. Cartwright. And I just want to tell you, Brady, how on par you are, because he starts out his book by he has all of the guys in here, but he broke it up by function: academia, art, economics, history, language, politics, architecture, because they infiltrate every aspect of our life. And I thought it was just like point on when you said that. Foreign Service, CIA, and their largest contingent is government. So what is the Ritchie Boys? The Ritchie Boys was a military intelligence service that was set up for World War II. And basically, they were taught how to interrogate prisoners on the fly, like in the middle of the theater, to get instantaneous intelligence. And they were also schooled in counterintelligence. And they got the name Ritchie Boys because they were all trained secretively, giving it kind of that air of secret society flavor, at Camp Ritchie in Washington County, Maryland. There were over 22,000 men and women that were sent to this camp and graduated from it. And they were all German speaking because they were going to be deployed inside of the German lines in order to gather intelligence. The majority of them were Jewish because they had to select from German speaking, not necessarily citizens, primarily citizens, but people who were living in the United States who spoke German. Well, there was a crap load of them that had come over in the last 10 years, 20 years because of Hitler. And so the preponderance of the Ritchie boys end up being Jewish. So you have these Jewish people sometimes inside Nazi Germany lines fighting on behalf of the US government. And they were, one of their primary training was in psychological warfare. Now, these guys are going to go trained psychological warfare people, and they're going to be running schools in America. They're going to be in your government. They're going to be in the CIA. And basically, so I wanted to just real quick, because we're not going to go into them. Go ahead.
Is that Cartwright the same one we were talking to on Twitter earlier today on our timelines?
Yes.
Great. Outstanding.
Yes. So just one guy, very first guy in the book. His name's Heinz Bondy, Bondy. Heinz Bondy he came from a multi-millionaire family of banking, real estate, and sugar. I just love how they overlap with each other. And the money in the family was used by the Bondy's parents to establish a progressive education schools both in Europe and in America. His mother, Gertrude Bondy, had studied under Sigmund Freud.
Oh, lovely.
And also was very good friends with his daughter, Anna Freud. So they created a school over in Germany, and then they moved to the United States, and they set up a school in a place called Windsor Mountain. Windsor Mountain was the name of the school, and Heinz Bondy then spends time in the U.S. military. He gets selected to be part of the Camp Ritchie crowd, and he deploys. He comes back and starts working at the school. And wouldn't you know that this school is known for narcotics, opium, LSD being filtered around not just the kids, but the staff as well. They go on to have complaints about stabbing there, at least one reported rape. And you get the distinct impression that it's a MK Ultra site.
Yeah, it sounds like a laboratory.
So then after things go to hell in a handbasket there in and I mean, this is Harry Belafonte's kids went there. This is a notorious Hollywood affiliated school. It wasn't just like a run of the mill. It was a very elite school. So once all of this bad stuff comes out and people withdraw their kids, he goes on to an administrative post at the University of Massachusetts. And he helped found the Elkins Mountain School in Washington State. And he also ends up being the director of the Christian Family Montessori School until his retirement. That's just one.
Yeah, we're going to obviously part of this series we'll do a full show on Ritchie Boys to go into a lot more detail, or at least one.
Because you're going to see that they overlap.
Well, yeah, and one of the themes that the gentleman you just discussed, that's one that absolutely the focus was on education. But what we're talking about is the infiltration of every institution, and you're going to see as we go to Skull and Bones, they've got their little fingerprints all over higher education in America, starting with Yale and Harvard University. We've already mentioned. But it makes perfect sense, what you just described. That story fits into the exact same picture.
Yeah. Okay.
So if we want to look at a high level of how well they've infiltrated all of our institutions, we don't know every single person that's been in Skull and Bones. And again, they stopped sharing the information around 1997. But if you take 15 members times what it's from 1833 to call it 1997, that's 164 years. Multiply that by 15, you get 2,460 bonesmen over the last almost 50 years. So we're looking at a base of 2,460 people. From that, we've gotten 3 presidents of the United States. We got Taft and both Bushes. Now, what are the odds of getting 1 out of 2,460 into the presidency? Much less 3. Okay, that's fine. These are connected people. We know to get ahead in politics, you've got to come from certain families or you got to have connections. Okay. But 3 seems like a lot. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree.
Okay.
Statistically speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. If this is, if this is just purely organic, just these, people in this fraternity or this secret society they just pick the best of the breed, the best of the best from one of the top schools. Yeah, maybe you can explain it. We'll see. How about 19 U.S. senators? Almost all of them before the 20th century. Of those U.S. senators, Connecticut had 4 U.S. senators. So if you think about it, in about a 70-year period, each senator probably sits for 15 years on average. Pretty much half of Connecticut's U.S. Senate representation came from Skull and Bones. And you'd see other states, New York, a lot of Massachusetts, Delaware, got 1 Louisiana, but you see almost none of these people from the South.
None. Yeah. They were unworthy.
Yeah. The South did not get into Ivy League schools, or not too much at least. There's always exceptions. I have 1 senator from Louisiana, 1 from Kentucky later on, but it's pretty rare.
Well, but understand that the Kentucky one, you had several of those, like the Vanderbilts that went down to the Carolinas and built the big, so they're originally from that crowd. They just come down like Belmead in Kentucky, and they built these monster big summer palaces in the South. And so then a generation or 2, it looks like they're from Kentucky when in fact they're really not.
Yeah, well, look at Bush in Texas. The guy grew up a Yankee, and he runs around with a Texas cowboy hat on, which, all right. Interesting. Yeah, and you bring up the Vanderbilt. Well, what state is Vanderbilt University in? Tennessee. So yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
We would call them carpetbaggers to some degree.
Yes, we would.
All right, let's talk about more bonesmen in the U.S. government. How about 33 U.S. congressmen, of which 4 were from Connecticut?
Wow.
Again, all across the northern states, Connecticut, New Jersey, there's Nebraska thrown in there, some New York's, a little bit of Ohio, but just congressmen. And some of these are names and we're going to go, as we go through the individual names in the future episodes of this series, some of them have some pretty juicy details, which we'll skip for now. How about this? 14 governors, including 3 consecutive in Connecticut. So basically you have a monopoly on Connecticut politics with Skull and Bones.
So is Connecticut's flag the skull and crossbones?
May as well be, huh? There's some fun names in the governors. Harriman is one of them. Harriman's a name that's going to be all over this whole Skull and Bones story, so remember that name. Of course, you got to have a little bit of influence in the state assemblies. I found 13 state assembly members or state senators. Doesn't seem like a whole lot there. One of them was interesting. A guy by the name of Everts from Vermont would end up being a Harriman lawyer, which is basically a law firm in and of itself. All right, so that's basically the political states positions. Quite a bit of influence statistically out of a base of 2,460 people, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
And that this doesn't
like
happen.
A hidden hand.
Yeah, it's almost like you get named to be a candidate. You've got to be part of an insider club. It's a big club, and we ain't in it. Wasn't that the expression?
Selections and not elections.
Bingo. So, what's the point of having this kind of power and influence if you're not going to, be the puppet master and control foreign policy? And what have we talked about from day one in Gladio? The whole purpose is of our foreign policy has been for more than a century, is basically to exploit other countries so that our multinational corporations, our trading houses, can get cheap labor and resources. And that has been our foreign policy. There's more to it than that when it comes to Europe, etc. But you'd think that a group, if they were going to be the nefarious shadow government that we're describing, they would have some influence in our foreign policy, wouldn't you?
You would think that's one of their goals.
Yeah, well, it just so happens they've had 6 U.S. secretaries of state. 6. Now,
go ahead.
Well, we've only had, I believe, 57 secretaries of state.
So one fraternity had 10%.
Yeah. Statistically impossible?
Statistically impossible.
Yeah. Some of the secretaries of state played pretty important stories, pretty important roles in the stories we've been telling. There was Stimson, who I know you've talked about.
Yep.
There was Bundy, who was the assistant sec state. A guy by the name of Lord, who was the assistant sec state. And, of course, John Kerry, one of the more recent ones. All bonesmen.
Was John Foster Dulles one?
John Foster Dulles was not a bonesman.
Okay. Because I know, why was I thinking? There's somebody.
Yeah, the connection to John Foster Dulles is through Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm.
Okay.
So the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm has hired a number of bonesmen throughout the years, but more importantly, they represented the interests of a lot of these blue blood families, like the Harrimans, the Walkers, the Bushes. That's the connection there. But
so it must have been, when I was researching John Foster Dulles, it must have been that he worked with there was 2 that was very notable to me that he worked with, and for some reason I just assumed he was one too. Okay.
No, I mean, I've got 2 lists of bonesmen, and he was not on either one. And I've made the mistake. I've thought the same thing once or twice, but no, okay. There is a direct professional connection, without a doubt.
Yes.
And it goes back for decades of who he represented, their exact interests. And Sullivan and Cromwell, they're the ones who invented this tax-free foundation, which we talked about last week. While these foundations hide all their wealth, generational wealth behind. So yeah, there is a connection, just not the skull and bones connection.
Not direct.
Council of Foreign Relations, big mover and shaker, and of course our foreign policy. Guy by the name of Seymour was one of the founding members. He's skull and bones. Guy by the name of Lord, I think it's Lord II. He's also a CFR guy for quite a while, and we'll talk. He'll be one of the more of the names we focus on. How about 5 known CIA operatives from Skull and Bones, including, these names: Davison, Whitehouse, Bush, of course, Coffin, who was an interesting one. Coffin was a peace activist, but also a CIA member. Fun. He's a bones.
You love those.
Well, yeah, that's what we talk about. What you do is what we talked about with Hegelian dialectic. You get the opposites to collide, and that's where they get the synthesis. Right. This is part of their game plan over and over again. This guy was probably the perfect setup for that. The last CIA guy, which drives conservatives nuts when they hear this, was Buckley, the founder of the National Review, the conservative. Yeah, he was CIA too, and he's a bonesman.
He is one of the most interesting people from a Hegel kind of perspective, because he operated in one sphere publicly, but was very much in a different sphere in reality.
Yeah, a lot of people call Buckley the father of conservatism in the 20th century. And you go back and read some of his writing, knowing what we know now, and it's a pretty interesting study to be done. Was he pushing policy for a certain agenda, or was it his idea of conservatism is very inconsistent with, I think, where the movement has gone, and it probably was pushing us in a lot of direction, a lot of neocon type directions, and that makes sense if you look at his background, I would say.
Well, he is what I have come to understand. The word that they use when you start looking into this very deeply is they referred to it as the New Right. The New Right was actually composed of a whole bunch of very communist Marxist people. Many of them were actually registered card-carrying members of the Communist Party USA. But they end up in the quote-unquote New Right when they realize that they're not going to be able to affect the change that they want, card carrying communists. So they basically, like a reptile, morph themselves into what has been academically labeled as the New Right. And so when you see that term, almost inevitably, the person that they're talking about used to be an actual Marxist, socialist, or communist, and they vary because a couple of the guys end up in literally every one of those before they become a New Right.
Once again, the polar opposites. That's the juxtaposition. This is Hegel speaking right there.
Yes.
All right. So, how about 18 U.S. ambassadors or bonesmen? Sound about right?
Actually, I would have thought it was a little higher myself.
I've come up with 18, but there's some pretty interesting ones. We talked about Taft, who was ambassador to Austria and Russia. There's a guy named Zorthian, who was actually the ambassador and the press officer in Saigon at a really interesting time period, 1960s. At the same time, there's a guy named Whitehouse, and we will dig into him because he was the ambassador to Laos and Thailand in the 1970s after serving on some other positions. Have you ran into Whitehouse before?
Oh yeah, because he was instrumental in the coup operations that were going on over there.
Yep, absolutely. I'll tell you a story about Laos offline here. I don't think it's appropriate for public because somebody I know would be involved in it. I used to know someone whose father was a general in Laos, and they came to the country in about 1975. Their father was on the losing side of that, so I got to know that story pretty well. A lot of bonesmen ambassadors have United Nations connections. Wadsworth was one of the first ambassadors of the UN, and there's another guy by the name of Draper III, who was the chair of the United Nations Developmental Program. When I say United Nations Development Program, what do you think of?
For me, it's regime change.
Yeah, it's these NGOs that go in there. Yeah. And this one's coordinating it. This is one of the coordinate. Yeah. The other fun name here is, of course, George Herbert Walker III. He was our ambassador to Hungary for a while. And that's that part of for those who don't recognize George Herbert Walker, that's a distant relative of the Bushes and the Walkers, those two families married together. So pretty good representation from Skull and Bones in terms of foreign policy, would you say?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, what's the other part of foreign policy? That's the diplomatic side of foreign policy. How about the military side? Think it makes sense to have anybody there?
Well, since they dress up CIA agents as military people, I'm going to go ahead and say yes.
Yeah, it's a good guess. Yeah, not your first rodeo.
Not my first one.
So I count 15 people that have been at a, star level or above that have been bonesmen, that have been very highly connected in the military, including 3 secretaries of war or secretaries of defense.
Okay, that's crazy.
Yeah, and also an assistant secretary of war, which was Davidson, who you know well.
Yeah.
The secretaries of war were Taft, Stimson, and Lovett. And where do we see Lovett the first?
I don't know where we see him first. He
was on the Anderson Trust, which from the Operation Golden Lily.
Oh,
that's that Lovett. So we'll do a deeper dive into him for sure. Among those 3, we also have a brigadier general, a major general, a Confederate general, a captain in the Confederate Army, a brigadier general in the Civil War. We've got some NATO, multiple official, guy named Spofford. We've got McGeorge Bundy, a national security advisor. You remember him?
Yeah, he's dirty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of Bundys in Skull and Bones. And that's a very old American family. We got an undersecretary of the Air Force and a secretary of the Navy, all Bonesmen.
Who was the Navy guy?
That was Chafee.
Okay. The Secretary of the Navy is a very interesting position because they have a lot more authority than most people realize because of the maritime aspect of that job, which is why Roosevelt did some time there.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's worth pointing out that the Navy is the one branch that's had a contiguous intelligence division since the 1870s. None of the others did till World War II. So the Navy's always had more of an for the obvious reasons, but it's always been much more of an international presence than the other forces.
Correct.
Which means it's also more of a diplomatic role in many ways.
Right.
All right. We've got some other government offices. Obviously, the bureaucracy's got to be staffed. If you're going to infiltrate our government, you got to have people in the bureaucracy. I've got 31 notable bonesmen in different positions, and I'm just going to start going down some of them, and I'll stop with anything. Stop me if you hear anyone interesting and want to make a comment.
Okay.
All right. I got Norval Harrison. He's a private secretary to Jefferson Davis in the Confederacy. I've got a secretary of the Treasury. I got a secretary of the Navy, another one. Didn't have him above. That was Collins. I've got a postmaster general, a U.S. solicitor, an assistant secretary of state, another solicitor general. So everyone knows what a U.S. solicitor general is. This is the person who represents the U.S. government in cases at the Supreme Court. They are generally among the best courtroom lawyers in the land.
Correct.
It is no joke of a position. We've got your guy Stimson, again, who's the Governor General of the Philippines, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State. You knew that.
Yeah, that guy was around, didn't he?
Yeah, Stimson. Oh yeah, he's worthy of a show of his own. Lots of skeletons to uncover. So we talk about you create these institutions and you want to have your person in there to set the groundwork for. They got a guy named Pinchot, who's the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. And that happened right around the turn of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt was seizing all the government land, the federal land grab, which he unconstitutionally created. We did it to preserve the national forests. Well, yeah, and there's a few other reasons. So that was the first person to run the Forestry Service was a Bonesman. And of course, shortly thereafter, they had a Secretary of the Interior named Woodruff. The second chief of the U.S. Forestry was also a Bonesman. So they really wanted their hands on
that happening.
Yeah. I think they really wanted their influence on that agency, would you say?
I would say so.
How about
Wait a minute. Isn't that where they do all the weapon stashes in Gladio in the forestry?
I wouldn't have made that connection without you. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, you're right. That's why would you want to have so much control over the interior?
I'm going to be right back. Keep talking because I'm going to be able to hear you. I just need to duck out real quick.
Yeah, you got it. The next one's really neat. A guy by the name of Jay. He was the first chairman of the New York Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913. The New York Fed, which is the most important of the member banks, their first chairman is a Bonesman. About that same time, you've got a Secretary of the Treasury named McClung. A guy named Harrison would also be the Governor General of the Philippines. I think it was just after Stimson. We've got a guy, another director of the New York Fed named Adams will come along later. Guy by the name of Thatcher as another Solicitor General. So that's 3 Solicitor Generals in front of the Supreme Court came from one secret society. Next guy I've got is named Klaus. He was the president of the New York City Bar Association. And going down, guess what I have next? A third president of the New York Fed by the name of Harrison. That's 3 New York Fed chairs. the odds of that are pretty exorbitant.
Well, given the fact that we haven't had been that long, I mean, you were extrapolating the other numbers over the entire span, but
yeah, the other one's had another 80 years.
right? Wow.
Yeah. So you start to paint the picture that being a bonesman is probably pretty good for your career.
I'm getting the picture that they've been running our country. I don't know about you. Go ahead.
And do you think maybe that comes with some strings attached? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's the way. Yeah. What else? We got a librarian of Congress. I've got the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Gillespie. Got to be in charge of the judicial branch too, don't you?
Yes, either to block things from happening or to make things happen.
Absolutely. And you're kind of crafting the landscape of the direction of our whole legal profession in some of these choke point positions.
Well, especially the New York, the Southern District, as we've figured out, because that's where the UN is. That's where all of in most countries that have ambassadors in the United States also have an office in New York with a like an assistant ambassador there, like a consul there. And so the world revolving around New York. And if there's any criminal activity involved in any of that, as we found out with the FBI guy that was involved in the Russiagate thing, taking money from a foreign, that's where it's going to happen. So that is a critical choke point.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember that name Bundy we mentioned earlier?
Yes.
I've got another Bundy, William P. Bundy. He worked for the State Department at a pretty high level, but he's most known for being the liaison for the State Department at the Bay of Pigs.
I know.
Mm-hmm. That family gets around too. I've got a director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, a guy by the name of Kellogg. I've got another chairman of the SEC. Oh, and another chairman of the SEC, both Orrick and Donaldson. So that's pretty good from one secret society. Oh, here's a fun one. You're familiar with the Import-Export Bank, right?
I am.
It's how they do a lot of financing of international trade. Well,
I would say that's how they control international trade, but go ahead.
Quite a bit. It's a very influential office, to say the least. Yeah. We had two bonesmen in a row. One was Lord II. Remember, they were the Lord earlier. This would be his son. And another guy, Draper III. Both back-to-back chairs of the Import-Export Bank.
And what were those years?
Give me 1 second. I'll tell you that. It's right around the turn of the century. Where's Lord?
Because the reason that's important is because they use the Import-Export Bank to basically do the economic hitman activity on anyone that they were going to target to take over. So I was just interested in whether that was during a period of regime change. Lord
II was class of 1949.
But when was he at the Import-Export Bank?
I'll get that. So let me see if I can have that for you real quick. He was comptroller of the currency in 81. When was the Import-Export Bank? I do not have that handy.
Okay, I'll look at it.
Yep. And let's see if I can find the other guy real quick while I've got this up. Draper II was class of 1950. He was the chair of the United Nations Development Program and Import-Export Bank. He was doing. He was Korean War lieutenant, by the way. Yeah, we'll go more deeply. These will be some of the names we'll go more deeply into. There's a lot of things popping up in his bio.
Okay.
Just to finish up other government, we got a guy named Cowdery, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. A couple of recent bonesmen. Secretary of the Treasury Neil Mnuchin from the Trump administration. Yep, he was a bonesman. And of course, one of the more recent ones was Obama's Economic Recovery Board was Austin Goolsbee, who's best known for making a fool of himself from the University of Chicago's economics school. Goolsbee's like he's like Jim Cramer.
That's a great analogy.
He's a smart guy, but he's got an amazing ability to be dead wrong. And the guy's about as Keynesian as they come. All right, that's it for the random U.S. government. Think they've got any influence over a policy over the last century plus?
About that much.
All right. One of the most important institutions, of course, is the legal field, whether it be lawyers, law schools, judges. Do you think maybe the bonesmen might want to get involved in that?
A little bit.
All right. So we've had 2 U.S. attorney generals, 13 federal judges, including not 1, not 2, but 3 chief justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Wow.
Uh-huh. You want me to repeat that?
Yeah. Say that one more time for effect.
3 chief justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. And without counting them, I think we've had maybe 30 chief justices, probably less than that. I'll get that number for you next time. I should have looked that up.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Here's a fun one on this one.
Hold on. I gotta go.
Oops. I have no idea what the emergency is. I'll try to keep you all entertained in the meantime, but I'm not going to go on with the story. How about we go back and look at how many judges of the Supreme Court there have been? And I will edit this part out on my channel. But let's just take a look. All right, Supreme Court justices. On Wikipedia, it's a good way to count them. They give me a list. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Can't be right. No, that's current. I want the justices. Chief justices.
Oh.
What happened?
We have a neighbor that has a pit bull that attacked our dog several years ago and injured him. And we have new dogs. And my husband was getting the groceries that just got left on the front porch, and the dogs went out, and that dog got out. So I had to go help. The dogs are fine.
Excellent.
Holy crap. Okay.
Well, this is pretty amazing. And I'll edit this out, that part of it. I'm glad the dog's okay, though. That's a good reason to run.
Yeah.
I just looked it up. You can see the screen right now, right? Or can you?
No, because I broke my glasses trying to grab the dog.
Okay.
Come on. Go ahead.
Pop my screen up there when you can. Is it in there?
No, just
Can
us.
you put it on stage?
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's
No,
me.
no worries.
There
All
you
right. So there have been, you count them, 1 through 17 Supreme Court justices
go. Wow.
total. And 3 of them have been bonesmen. But I'll take it a step further. Because remember, Mr. Ellsworth, his descendant was Russell. So you can kind of count him as part of the bonesman lineage as well.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely
Wow.
amazing. I didn't realize it was quite that bad. There's my stop share.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. Think they have a little bit of influence on our judicial branch?
That's dumbfounding.
Uh-huh. State judge. But state courts are pretty darn important. I've got 10 that were significant. A couple of New York State Supreme Court, a guy by the name of Whitney. I bring up Whitney because the Whitney families are one of the bluest of the blue blood families. You don't hear much about them, but they've been around forever. I mean, that is pretty much the oldest New York money are the Whitneys. They might have named a mountain after them. Any other big names there? No. It's got some, speaking of the legal stuff, you've got founders of some very prestigious law firms. Guy named Sterling, who was co-founder of Shearman and Sterling, and we'll go into their history because that's really, really some really fun stuff. One of Taft's kids was Waters Taft. He was the co-founder of Cadwalader, Wickersham and Taft, very prestigious law firm. A guy by the name of Haven Jr. was a big railroad lawyer. Worked for Strong, Sturgis and Company. When you think railroad lawyer, think about the most dirty, bloodthirsty people you'd ever want. And of course, there's the famous Dilworth, who was famous for being the Rockefeller family lawyer. These are all bonesmen.
I didn't know that part. I've come across his name repeatedly in my Nelson Rockefeller's book, Thy Will Be Done. I didn't realize he was a bonesman, though.
Yeah, Dilworth is. He's got this. I bet you know some of the good stories about him, don't you? If you've done Rockefeller.
Yeah.
He's a guy you wouldn't want to have coming after you on a legal standpoint. Very much of a master of the dirty trick. All right. What other institutions should they get their grimy hands into? Oh, how about the church? So I've got 13 bonesmen that are considered clergymen. A couple of interesting ones was a guy by the name of Partridge. He was a bishop, an Episcopal bishop that went to Kyoto, Japan. We've got another guy, Aiken, who's a Congregationalist pastor who went to China. Anything else really interesting there?
So, go ahead.
Later on, we got a guy by the name of Buckdahl. He's actually a rabbi of New York City's Central Synagogue. Once they started letting Jews into the bones.
Yeah, again, I find the presence of them because if you step back and you think about it for a second, what we do know about their ceremonial goings on is very satanic. The fact that any of them are in the clergy is bothersome. Yeah,
it is. And that's one of those, when you read it, you got to read it twice the first time. I think a lot of the early bonesmen, were the clergymen. You probably saw less of them in the 20th century, but again, these were Puritans, these families. And if you look at the Puritan religions, I mean, they were probably the most hardcore. They believed in things like God predetermines whether you're going to heaven when you're born, and there's nothing you can do about it. There doesn't matter how perfectly you follow society's dictates, and that's where you got the whole Gilded Age class system. It's all the descendants of the Puritans. That's why we were so ripe to the Fabian Society coming over here. Those ideas just fit perfectly in with society. This is what the Gilded Age was all about, but it goes back centuries.
And it also allows them to do satanic type things because they don't believe that there's consequences to those.
Yeah, and it's also, and one of the things that pops up in my head is, the 1940s, 50s versions of these people, the Bushes, the Prescott Bushes, and everyone like that. These people called themselves rabid anti-communists because the communists were godless people. These people would stand on their pulpit and act holier than thou all day long while they're doing some of the most unchristian activities you could ever imagine. But they can justify it in their own minds. And that's the Puritan hypocrisy.
But that is what you just summarized is, like 700 pages of Nelson Rockefeller's life. Because you had John Dee, who was exploiting all of the land on the Indians in the early time. You had Nelson throughout all of South America creating expeditions to go out and hunt indigenous Indians. And the entire time, every Sunday, they talk about having, prayer before dinner and having the Sunday dinner at John D. Rockefeller, because they all lived like on a compound, and you always went to either dad's house or grandpa's house, and how strictly Puritan they were in the adherence to everything, biblical, while they went out and basically destroyed the world Monday through Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a holier than thou mentality. We see some of its ideological descendants in wokeism these days. It's the same kind of mentality. In some ways, I'm not going to completely try to break down psychologically the woke religion today on this show, but so a lot of clergymen there. I guess you probably want to have probably some influence on the information flow, like maybe the newspapers, huh? I've got 14 bonesmen that are either the founders or prominent editors of major periodicals, from the Chicago Tribune, Time Life. Luce and Haddon founded Time Life, both bonesmen. Editor of Fortune, publisher of Fortune. Gill, who founded the New Yorker. You had Buckley, who founded the National Review. You had Gunsberg, did the Viking Press. Milbank and Leonhardt, one's a WAPU columnist, and the other one's a New York Times columnist to this day. These are all bonesmen. So they've got their fingers in another institution.
And Luce, both him and his wife, played an integral part in almost everything Operation Gladio. She was over in Italy when they were basically setting up Operation Gladio there. JFK's the Zapruder film is found in his safe. And so if you look back over what stories Time did and what stories they didn't do, major gatekeeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess probably the most notorious is, how many times did Hitler get Man of the Year? Was it just once, or was it more than one time in Time magazine?
Yeah, well, and I mean that's hugely significant.
Well, it is, and then when we get into probably next week, if we do the Bushes and the Harrimans and everything like that, these are the bonesmen and their cronies. These are the ones who financed Hitler in the first place. At the same time, they were same people who were financing the Bolsheviks. This is what Anthony Sutton's talking about with the Hegelian dialectic.
Yes.
We're going to go much deeper into that, but it makes a ton of sense. Obviously, they're going to have their hands, this is a college secret society. They're going to have their hands all over academia. So you've got professors, from Latin to physics to chemistry all over Yale. Let's see if I can come up with some other interesting ones. So there's a bonesman named Whitney Blank Jr., who's a descendant of Eli Whitney. That was a professor. Professors at Harvard of theology, a couple of Greek professors, economists. Here's a guy named Fisher was a bonesman, one of the most famous eugenicists we ever had. There's a couple of a guy named Spitzer, who was a theoretical physicist. I think he was probably one of the good bonesmen. But NASA named one of their first deep space telescopes after Spitzer. I believe I've counted 8 Nobel Prize winners. And so they got their fingers all over academia, including 9 college presidents. 1, 2, 3 presidents of Yale, president of the University of Oklahoma. A guy by the name of Colt Gilman is in one of the very first classes of the Bonesmen. He'd be the president of not only UC Berkeley, but also the founder of Johns Hopkins. Now, those are 2 of the top universities in the country. So a guy came from Yale, runs Berkeley, and then sets up Johns Hopkins. And he's one of the original bonesmen.
And just keep in mind, when we talk academics, especially at the professor level, there are quite a few CIA actual agents posing in academia. And I would venture to say, while you look at the role that the CIA has people embedded everywhere. And so people that we think were never in the CIA actually were assets, even though they weren't agents.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about it a little bit last week with foundations. If you
Yeah.
want to really control a culture, you control universities, you control what is taught. It's not only by controlling the financing, but you put your people in charge of the universities. They're going to decide which professors are hired, which ones get tenure. You can basically shape the entire narrative of all of academia from a few Ivy League. Because remember, everything trickles down from the Ivy League. Always has, always will in academia. There are very few exceptions to that, and maybe Stanford and Berkeley.
And the other aspect of that is, Stanford's definitely the West Coast version of that. But what I have now come to appreciate is the significant presence of foreign nationals at all of the universities. And these assets, and that's why the president is so critical of these universities, is they are the ones that, working with their boards, that set the ability for these foreign nationals to come, and then they are used, co-opted, whatever you want to, groomed, whatever word you want to use. And they go back to their countries with funding streams, grants, whatever, to do work in those countries, and they become assets of this oligarch class to do their bidding in foreign countries.
That's absolutely. First one I think of course, is the Frankfurt School that came over to Columbia in 1934, but that's neither the first nor the last version of that. One of the educators we're going to talk about more was a Bonesman who basically was very adamant about bringing the Prussian education system over to our system. And as we talked about previously, the Prussian education system was about obeying the state and not thinking as an individual, which is about the most anti-American thing I can imagine. And that's basically taken over all of academia. And these people are all part of that. And, who would want a system like that where everyone's obedient to the state? Well, probably those who, tend to be authoritarian and rule the state. Just a hunch.
Yeah.
All right, let me finish this up with some prominent business leaders, because you do have to make money to run a good conspiracy. It takes money. I'm just going to go down a list. There's 31 prominent business members that are worth mentioning, and I'll just go down one by one. Stop me, comment. I'll pause between each one.
Okay.
Guy by the name of Frost, who built a bunch of submarine companies. We'll probably want to go into more detail on him. Parrott, who's one of many railroad executives. There'll be about 4 or 5 on the list that are railroad. That's important because the robber barons, the Northeast robber barons, really made a killing. Basically, they had government subsidized railroads where they privatized the profit. And that's where a ton of fortunes were built, which led us into the Gilded Age. Guy by the name of Phelps, he is the founder of Northern Trust. Very big investment bank. Another railroad company. Guy by the name of Cochran, he's a partner at the previously mentioned J.P. Morgan. Whitney's a Bonesman. He just ran the family business, but the Whitneys are so expansive and pervasive. That's a huge multinational conglomerate in and of itself. Same thing with there's a Vanderbilt kid who ran the family business. Yeah, we got a Vanderbilt who's a Bonesman too. Got another railroad executive. Here's one of our favorites, Percy Rockefeller. One of the co-founders of Brown Brothers Harriman. That was Averell Harriman's International Bank, the ones who financed Hitler. Percy Rockefeller is also the chair of Standard Oil. And little known fact that he was the founder of, the owner or CEO of Remington Arms.
Yeah.
I got the guy by the name of Stanley. Yeah, he's a co-founder of Morgan Stanley, one of the Wall Street giants. He's a Bonesman. You got Averell and Roland Harrington, both founding partners of Brown Brothers Harriman. We've talked about. Prescott Bush is a founding partner of Brown Brothers Harriman. Here's a guy by the name of Mallon, and he's the CEO of something called Dresser Industries. Ever heard of them?
Uh-uh.
That's because they're now known as Halliburton.
Oh, oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Starting to see some connections.
Yeah.
That's Dick Cheney and Bush. Yeah. Okay. Let's skip over. Oh, I got the founder of Pan American Airways.
And that's a CIA affiliate.
I thought, yeah, and Pan American, of course, they're doing most of their flying around the Caribbean and South America, right?
Yeah. What was his name?
Trippe, Trippe.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Another businessman, guy with a familiar sounding name, George Herbert Walker Jr. He's the co-founder of the New York Mets. A guy by the name of Kostikyan is a partner later on at Brown Brothers Harriman. You had Heinz II, who's one of the heirs to the Heinz family, who, of course, was where John Kerry, who's a bonesman, married into the Heinz family. No coincidence there. A little incestuous for you. Got a guy by the name of Davison. He was one of the co-founders of the U.S. Trust Corporation, or the head of it. U.S. Trust Corporation is pretty big in finance. Guy named Galbraith, who was a managing director at Morgan Stanley. Oh, Donaldson, co-founder of DLJ, one of the biggest investment banks. I bring this up. It's important to Wall Street connections. The companies that get financed by Wall Street, Wall Street job is not only to come up with the capital, but to sell the money, to basically raise capital from the investors. That's why they have this whole army of financial advisors and brokers to sell this to the public. You don't get underwritten unless you're connected for the most part. So it is an old boys network on Wall Street like you wouldn't believe. And the ability to raise capital for the favored few is a big, big deal. It is all about access on Wall Street. Same thing in Silicon Valley. You see it today, and DLJ is involved in both. Well, Donaldson's a co-founder of DLJ. Donaldson, Lufkin, Jeanette, for those who pay attention. Oh, the founder of FedEx was a guy by the name of Wallace Smith. I'm going to leave this one for last. I got another one, Lambert, a very rich kid. He was the founder of ESL Investments. The L is Lambert, but he's also the current chairman of the Sears Holding Company. Last one is a guy by the name of Schwartzman. He's the founder of Blackstone. BlackRock is a spinoff from Blackstone. That's Schwartzman. He's a bonesman. There's your connections. And that's what I've got for today.
That's kind of like the mic drop moment right there.
Yeah. I thought I'd save him for last.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the theory. Are the bonesmen just an innocent group? Skull and Bones, just an innocent group of people who do some networking among people that have a fraternal interest? Or is there something more going on?
Or have they been distributed among all of the power places in the United States over the history of their existence at critical choke points in order to be able to control outcomes?
Exactly. This is the shadow government. These are the puppet masters. Let me ask the question a different way. If you're sitting there 200 years ago and you basically wanted to, you and a few chosen people think you're better than everyone else, and you wanted to basically, I don't know, manage the future of the country and the world and create a new world order, would you have done things any differently than these guys are doing it?
But it also makes you want to ask, in order to be able to control them so that they don't double cross you, what is the initiation? What pictures do they have? What blackmail do they have? Because talking about statistics, you're going to get one or two that don't want to play along, or that has been asked to do something that they find unequivocally unacceptable to do.
It's perfectly, or just grew a conscience at some point later in life. Somebody found God.
Yeah, but none of them do.
No, and again, the first real list we got was from Charlotte Iserbyt, because her father was a bonesman who passed away, and she was going through her belongings. Said, I recognize what this is, and I know who could use it, and took it straight to Anthony Sutton at Stanford, at the Hoover Institution. So no, I mean, they've kept the secret pretty. And you bring up a great question. And since we don't know the answers, we can speculate all day long. We know the stories and the rumors, about naked coffins and all that sort of thing, but is it verifiable? I don't know. I don't know.
One of them speaks.
What's that?
Not until one of them speaks.
No. And obviously there's a reason they haven't. So
correct. Which lends the credence to the speculation.
Yeah. And of course, let's look at the symbolism, the skull and bones. That is, again, all the connections to opium trading. And it's there everywhere you look.
Piracy.
Oh, absolutely. Just looking up something I had on Yale University. It's the third oldest university, founded in 1701, founded on Orthodox Puritanism, which is about as rigid as it comes. That's why you got the witch trials. They believed in something called total depravity or original sin, and unconditional election, which is the predestination. What was I looking up on the some of the other names of the skull and bones? They had some other names for it. It's 322 is a magic number there. It's also called the Order. That's how Sutton always refers to them, as the Order. It's also called chapter 322 is a German secret society, and yet it's all over their books. Members are sworn to silence. It only exists on Yale campus. Sutton estimated at any given time only 25% were active, and about 25 to 30 families have come to dominate the whole thing. It's interesting.
And you mentioned at the beginning that you have the 15 selected as junior class to spend their senior class as the bonesmen on the university. And you have to imagine that decision of which 15 it's going to be, understand the upstream part of that. First of all, they have to be able to get into Yale as freshmen. And they have to, because there's no way that if they're going to be utilized in the way in which we believe that they're utilized, that it's the upperclassmen deciding which of those 15 juniors are going to be in that class. This is a very long grooming process to get to the point where you're a junior at Yale and you're going to be one of the 15.
Yeah, and the grooming goes back to the growing up. You have your coming out parties, your debutantes, all those sort of things, your entry into society. That's still a thing in upper crust society, especially on the East Coast. And you talk about how to get into Yale in the first place. Well, if you're a legacy in Yale, you got to be a major screw up not to be, so it's the whole system to not to be admitted. The whole system is set up for the family lineage. And, that's one of the ways they keep this thing tight together. You are born into this family, this lineage. We are above the Cretans below you. And they don't say it so much, and you don't hear them speak of the words like that, but it certainly shows up in the deeds.
Right. And that's what I want people to think of, that this isn't just because, again, we have preconditioned. We're preconditioned to believe that, in a normal society, in a normal sorority or fraternity, because they're not up to evil deeds, they do just collectively out on the campus decide who's going to join, and they vote on it and all that other stuff. That's not how any of this works. And that's just, I wanted to reiterate that this is decades long grooming processes for you to even show up in the junior class at all at Yale. And then the fact that you're going to be one of those 15 was probably determined, a good decade before that, based on a whole bunch of other factors.
I would imagine they've always got a Bonesman alumni or two working in the Yale faculty. And that's sort of like the on-campus advisor, trying to, picking out talent, weeding out, separating the chaff from the wheat according to their standards. Occasionally you'll get somebody who's just, a really bright, kid from the suburbs will get into Yale based on their mind and studies. And some of these people will get into skull and bones. They'll be allowed into the order, but I'm guessing they're never allowed to be invited to certain parties, or they can't date in certain groups, because the class system is still alive and well. and I've seen it firsthand. So
Yeah, that's crazy.
well, next week we're going to do more granular into some of the bones. We can do this one of two directions. Either I can just start doing it chronologically, and you can start giving some connections, and you can just tie that into your narrative, or we can jump straight to the bushes and all those tendrils. I can do it either way. We'll get to the bushes quickly, but
I think because of next week being right after Christmas, do you want to do next week, or do you want to skip it and pick it up after the holiday?
So Christmas is Wednesday. Christmas Day is Wednesday of next week.
Correct.
Let's do the show. Let's do it on the. I'm good to go on the 26th.
Okay. So I think if that's the case, then we ought to do the bushes.
Okay. So that's going to be this will be the biggest, most juiciest of them all.
Yeah.
So that gives me plenty of time. I'm going to have the whole Miro board set up with all the different connections, because we're going to need the visual, because that's one heck of a spider web.
Yeah. Yeah, and I did a dive on them as well. There's a video on my Substack that traced their lineage all the way back to the ship captain. So it'll be interesting to compare notes.
Yeah, I don't have that, so I'm not going to bother doing it. You bring that information. In fact, we can actually start with that. Well, once we introduce the first of the walkers, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Next Thursday.
If I don't see you before then, you have yourself a very Merry Christmas.
You have a Merry Christmas too, and thank you.
Same to everybody watching. Cheers, everyone.
Merry Christmas, everybody.